And then 2004 comes around, and now it's looking like 30% managed services, 50% managed services, 100% managed services. How many MSPs are there? That's an important question. I get that question posed to me all the time. If I had a nickel for every single time someone asked me, hey, Charles, how many MSPs exist? You get the point. I'd have a lot of nickels. But the answer to that question is important. And it's important that we understand what that number is and what it represents. And while it's not as easy as you may imagine, you've come to the right place. Stick around for the answer coming up next. All right. How many MSPs are there? 50,000, 100,000, 200,000, 250,000. I've heard ranges all over the map. Very, very little consistency. I can tell you anecdotally, and I'll give you, in a moment, I will give you my take on what the actual number is. But suffice it to say that there's so many different sources of information about how many MSPs exist on the planet. From my perspective, in order to understand the answer, to get to the answer, there's a little bit of historical context, because that's going to lead to how I define what an MSP is, because you can't really answer the question of how many MSPs there are until you answer the question, what is an MSP? So let's start there and the historical perspective. So MSPs have been around since the early 1990s. I know for some of you who are a little bit younger, you may say, well, that was before I was born. I didn't realize that was that old of a profession. It's that old. I remember in the early 2000s when I was interviewing some of the older generation of MSP professionals at that time, they were talking about early variants of the managed services profession showing up as early as the 80s. Now, granted, the technology was really, really archaic, especially by today's standards, but it was very different, very difficult. Suffice it to say that very few of the tools that we understand and appreciate and use today in the managed services community, very few of those existed, right? But the business model as a concept had certainly emerged maybe as early as the 80s, but it was definitely being practiced in the early and by the mid-90s, starting chiefly with the ASP movement, which ASP, Application Service Provider, which more commonly today we call that SaaS, Software as a Service. But it was managed services applied at the application level, right? It was an MSP model in essence, where the object of the service was the application, whatever that may have been. But why am I telling you this? Because it's important to understand that the evolution of the managed service provider profession started back as early as the early to mid 1990s ever since, and we have been on a continual evolutionary line, moving away from reactive IT, moving towards proactive IT management, right? I'm sure those of you who are fans of the channel, you've listened to the podcast, you've read our material before, you've been to the MSP World conferences, you understand this, you've heard this before. That's important. We're on an evolutionary path of break fix, reactive, where we came from and where we're headed to. Some already have arrived there, but some are still on that evolutionary path and journey. You're moving towards managed services, proactive IT management, in other words. So you have that perspective, and now you have a period between, let's say, 2004 to 2008, where prior to that period, vast majority, the overwhelming majority of the IT channel, and the IT channel is humongous. I've never heard anyone who actually ever counted or attempted to count the number of providers or resellers or entities that are involved in the IT channel, but it's in the hundreds of thousands. Absolutely. Especially when you take into consideration the manufacturers, the software, hardware manufacturers, the distributors, the value-added resellers, the value-added distributors, the managed service providers, the hosting companies, and on and on and on, right? There's so many different facets of the IT channel globally that certainly in the hundreds of thousands would be not difficult to imagine. But in 2004 to 2008, roughly, it was about a 4, 5, 6 year period, somewhere in there, that we had a rapid evolutionary growth spurt that kind of propelled the IT channel away from break, fix, reactive to proactive managed services. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons. There's some economic reasons. There are some just time factors. There's the access to some tools that at the SMB and mid-market levels had not yet fully matured or had not fully made their way across the globe into the hands of the SMB mid-market focused providers. But around that mid-2000s timeframe, you had all of those critical elements start to click into place. And then all of a sudden, you had a just massive growth spurt of the industry, and you had a massive evolutionary advancement where it was prior to that 2004-2005 timeframe. It was kind of experimental. Managed services was, I'm dabbling a little bit of it. Maybe I have 1 or 2 managed services clients, but the vast majority of my clients are break fix, time and materials, or consulting or whatever they were selling. And then 2004 comes around, and now it's looking like 30% managed services, 50% managed services, 100% managed services. There was one company I remember had said that in the early 2000s they made a choice, and they said that they remembered the actual day on which they made a conscious choice to say, we're not going to be a reactive break fix company anymore. We're going to be an MSP. And they started rejecting break fix clients, and they said, you're going to engage with us as an MSP client or not at all. And that was their evolutionary cutoff point, if you want to call it. But there was a massive growth evolutionary moment in those middle 2000s. You had tens and tens of thousands of new companies being created, migrating from old business models into a newer managed services proactive business model. Now, why is that all important? Why am I telling you this? Well, because it's important to the next question, which is the definition of an MSP. Now, I've kind of already given you my definition. I've talked about it in other episodes. I've written about it a lot, but it's important to keep reminding everyone what our working definition of an MSP is. Now, you may have a different definition, but this is the definition that we are communicating to different governments and policy and regulatory and legislative bodies all over the world. And we've been doing that for a while now. So if you have a different definition of managed services, let us know. But this is the one that we've been using for quite some time, about 20 years. It's proactive IT management of an IT object or asset. That's a very generic term, but it is distinctly different from time and materials, break fix, or reactive IT work where you are waiting for something to happen and then you pounce on it. Then you start to go into action. And I'll repeat this because I think it's a really useful kind of a short litmus test that can be used. Generally speaking, it's correct. There's some exceptions to that, but that's leave that for another time. But if you want to know if you're an MSP or not, a MSP will make money when the customer's network is running with no problems. That's when the MSP makes its margin. That's when the MSP is happiest. It's also when the customer is happiest. There are no problems. Now, that assumes that the MSP is doing a series of proactive maintenance measures throughout the year, the quarter, the month, to make sure that client and all the other clients are up and running, safe, protected, resilient, available. You know the drill. The break fix company makes its money when the client has pain. Think about it. If the client has pain and the provider is generating revenue, chances are you're not dealing with an MSP. You're dealing with a reactive break fix, time and materials type of shop. Now, some of you out there might be saying, geez, that sounds like me, but I have an RMM tool and I have a backup tool and I have a ticket system and I have all these other MSP tools in my MSP tool belt, and I go to MSP conferences, and oh my gosh, does that mean I'm not an MSP? Well, I'm not saying that, because again, there could be a blend of customers that you have, even legitimate, companies that I would say that's definitely an MSP. I've known a lot of those companies to have, a small handful, mind you, of customers who are just refusing to be on board with this whole managed services thing. They don't want to pay it. They don't want to engage in that type of economic, business model and relationship. But it's not the majority. And it's certainly not the type of thing where a new customer who comes along says, hey, I want to engage with you on a reactive model. Most MSPs, legitimate MSPs, will say to that type of customer, thanks, but no thanks. That's not our business model anymore. Go someplace else. So how does an MSP have non-managed services customers? Traditionally, they're legacy, right? But the point is that a good MSP is trying to whittle down those few remaining stragglers and either convince them to become managed services clients, or they're telling them, we can't service you anymore. It's just not what we do. We're an MSP. We're not a reactive break fix shop. If that's what you want, that's not what we do. It's not safe anymore for us to do that. And it's not safe for you as the recipient of those services. That's the evolutionary model I've been talking about. Now, we've defined high level, but we've defined what an MSP is. We've talked about what the evolutionary kind of path has been for the MSPs since the early 1990s. Now, let's apply that to the question of the day. How many MSPs exist out there in the world? Well, 10 years ago, I probably would have said there's about 100 to 150,000 MSPs that existed. Now, this would have been, well, maybe a little bit, maybe 15 years ago, a little bit before the financial crisis of 2009. We lost a decent number of providers then, but in actuality, for every one provider we lost during that time period, we probably had 2 new MSP organizations pop up. And that typically is the case. So there's always been a fairly high level of new entrants into the MSP profession. Back to the question, how many are there? Well, if I said 100 to 150,000 MSPs, that would be assuming that they're all have a majority of their customers who are doing managed services. If you start to apply that real number to an entity that has, maybe 50% of their customers are break fix, then that's a much different number. That's a lower number. If you start to take away those types of reactive IT break fix shops from the equation of the number of MSPs, then you start to have a number that's probably closer to 20 or 30,000 MSPs, globally speaking. Now, some of you might be panicking, like some of you who sell to MSPs, you might be saying, this is not good. We told our investors that we have a total addressable market of 150,000 MSPs. What happened? Calm down. There's some good news here. Remember, we talked about an evolutionary process. And the evolutionary process cannot take place without several major things, characteristics being in place, being in existence. One of those things is tools, right? So if you are in the tool business of selling tools to MSPs or services to MSPs, you're in a good place, because chances are, if those tools are necessary for the company in question to be a provider of managed services to their customers, then you are helping them evolve. There's nothing wrong with that. There's still a very good, strong, very strong market for that type of work. What I'm talking about is a provider who has the right tools. Conceivably, they know how to use those tools in a managed services fashion, and yet they still refuse to engage with either a sizable portion of their existing clientele, and here's the critical thing, or they continue to onboard new clients in a non-managed services fashion. That is to say, a new customer comes to them and says, hey, I'd like to have you do some work for us, but all we want is a time and materials reactive relationship with you. Will you do that for us? Those types of companies are not long for the world because they haven't figured out how to say no. They haven't figured out how to adequately convince that type of reactive customer and why it's unsafe and why it's no longer an accepted practice to deliver reactive IT services. But more importantly, it's against public policy. Think about it. Every framework on the planet today, every cybersecurity framework is, to be careful about how I say it, is a managed services required framework. That is to say, all these frameworks that you see popping up all around the world, they are frameworks that can only be implemented in the hands of a managed service provider. None of the frameworks that we see today, globally speaking, can be implemented in a non-managed services fashion. That is to say, it can't be implemented by a break-fix company. It's impossible. If you don't believe me, look at the controls and figure out if any of those controls could be delivered in a reactive way. That is to say, that the provider just sits around and waits for that control to magically implement itself and to maintain and monitor itself and keep a perfect level of stasis. That is, it's not changing. It is impossibility, folks. It cannot happen. Therefore, number one, it's a huge testament to the power and the growth and the evolutionary validity of the MSP market and the IT channel in general over the last 4 decades. But it's also a really good reason for you to get out of the break-fix reactive business for once and all. There is no room for it anymore. And so I will finally end up, this whole session and talk about the number. What's the number that I think is real? I think that it's probably realistic, applying a fair definition of managed services like what I gave you previously, that we're looking at around 30,000 MSPs around the world. Now, in my opinion, that's not nearly enough. I'm telling you it's not enough to do the job. We are in the middle of a very serious fight. This cyber war that we are fighting is not going to be won with these many MSPs. We need more help. The MSPs that are out there are already strapped. They're at the limit. They need help. They need more MSPs to help pick up the slack. And that is my assessment. We need more MSPs. We need the evolutionary process to continue. And we need to get out of the market the non-managed services, reactive IT break-fix companies, because they are not helping us win that cyber war. And in my opinion, they should not be and are not to be counted in the number of MSPs that are out there. I hope this helped. If you have any comments, please leave them or feel free to reach out to us. But that's my opinion. Talk to you next time.